Jacobs. I am a teacher at Tanglewood Middle School, 6th grade, ELA, and today we are returning to the novel Seed Folks by Paul Fleischman. Our objective lesson for today is generating questions. The takes we will be covering are questions about text before, during, and after reading to deepen understanding and gain information. We will also be doing 6.5F, which is making inferences, reading between the lines and making conclusions based on evidence. So making inferences and using evidence to support our understanding. And finally, the last take we'll be covering is 6.E, interacting with sources in meaningful ways, such as note-taking, annotating, free writing, or illustrating. So let's get started. Here's what you'll need. Obviously, you'll need your copy of Seed Folks. And as you look right here on the website for Seed Folks, a teacher gave that to us. So if you're unable to go to a bookstore or you cannot get it at the library, even though it is available at the Houston Public Library or at Barnes & Noble, you can always go online, follow that link, and you will see the PDF available on a teacher's website. You will need a copy of the Seed Folks, ideally something you can write on. So PDF form would be great. Lined paper, pencil or pen, and a highlighter. So today we're going into chapter 4, which again is entitled With a Character's Name. Since each chapter is part of a vignette of fictional characters connecting to each other within the fictitious world of Seed Folks, which takes place in a city in Ohio. So chapter 4 is about a character named Gonzalo. So here's our warm-up, which is all about forming opinions. Let me move my screen. So your warm-up is to imagine you are moving to a new country with a new language. Would it be easier to learn it through TV shows or school? Or do you think there's another way to learn a new language quickly? If so, how? I'll read that again. Imagine you were moving to a new country with a new language. Would it be easier to learn it through TV shows or school? Or do you think there is another way to learn a new language quickly? If so, how? So I'm curious about your opinion, and it is possible that it could be an amalgamation as the answer, meaning it could be that you learn quickly a new language from TV shows as well as from school, as well as from your peers, the people that you spend time with in school, even if it's virtual learning, as we're doing currently. Or maybe you learn best through reading, or maybe you learn best from listening to radio shows, or possibly on podcasts. So it could be Duolingo. Maybe you would learn best through an app like that. So take a moment to answer that question. Moving on. Chapter 4 is entitled Gonzalo, and here we're going to focus on making inferences. The older you are, the younger you get when you move to the United States. So this is the opening line of chapter 4. The older you are, the younger you get when you move to the United States. They don't teach you that equation in school, meaning the equation of the older you are, the younger you get when you move to the United States. They don't teach you that equation in school. Big brain, Mr. Smoltz, my 8th grade math teacher, hasn't even heard of it. It's not in Gateway to Algebra. It's Garcia's equation. I'm the Garcia. Here's your activity. A paradox is a contradictory statement. Highlight the paradox in the excerpt above. So if we know paradox is a contradictory statement, you're saying one thing, but you're saying the opposite at the same time. You're saying one thing, but simultaneously saying an opposing, completely contradictory statement at the same time. That's a paradox. So within these 2 paragraphs, there is one contradictory statement. Where is it? Take a moment to highlight it. So if you guess this, the older you are, whoops, the older you are, the younger you get when you move to the United States. That's a contradiction. This idea of aging somehow making you younger. That's a contradictory thought. So if you thought the first sentence was the paradox, you are correct. Nice work. Oops, we're missing a word in here. We're missing a linking verb. What is the name of the character speaking? What is the name of the character speaking? Circle the character's name. So we know the chapter is called Gonzalo, but we don't know whether Gonzalo is the person speaking. So I'm going to read it again. The older you are, the younger you get when you move to the United States. They don't teach you that equation in school. Big brain Mr. Smoltz, my 8th grade math teacher, hasn't even heard of it. It's not in Gateway to Algebra. It's Garcia's equation. I'm the Garcia. So what character are we going to circle? Is it Mr. Smoltz or is it Garcia? What is the name of the character speaking? If you said Garcia, you are absolutely correct. Nice work. Okay, moving on. Creating questions. Activity. Create 3 questions based on the text below. I'm going to read this once, then we're going to pause, and then we'll listen to it and you'll read along a second time. Creating 3 questions based on the text below. So keep that in the back of your mind as we read it along. 2 years, this is Garcia still talking. 2 years after my father and I moved here from Guatemala, I could speak English. I learned it on the playground and watching lots of TV. Don't believe what people say. Cartoons make you smart. But my father, he worked all day in a kitchen with Mexicans and Salvadorians. His English was worse than a kindergartner's. He would only buy food at the bodega down the block. Outside of there, he lowered his eyes and tried to get by on mumbles and smiles. He didn't want strangers to hear his mistakes. So he used me to make phone calls and to talk to the landlady and to buy things in the store where you had to use English. He got younger, I got older. He'd been a farmer, but here he couldn't work. He couldn't sit out in the plaza and talk. There aren't any plazas here, and if you sit out in public, some gang driving by might use you for target practice. He couldn't understand TV, so he wandered around the apartment all day, in and out of rooms, talking to himself, just like a kid in diapers. So the assignment is to create 3 questions based on that text that we've just read together. And I created one of the questions to get us going. The example I'm giving is, what is a bodega? Now, you can use context clues here to figure it out. He would only buy food at the bodega down the block. So the context clue here would be buying food, because obviously this place, this bodega, is a place where you can buy food. That's our context clue. So what can you guess would be a bodega if you didn't know? A bodega is a Spanish-based word that means convenience store in America. So that makes sense. You could buy food at the bodega down the block, at the convenience store down the block. Now it's your turn to create 3 questions based on the text below. So I'm going to read that one more time. 2 years, and while I'm reading it, try to come up with those questions. You need 3 questions. 2 years after my father and I moved here from Guatemala, I could speak English. I learned it on the playground and watching lots of TV. Don't believe what people say. Cartoons make you smart. But my father, he worked all day in a kitchen with Mexicans and Salvadorians. His English was worse than a kindergartner's. He would only buy food at the bodega down the block. Outside of there, he lowered his eyes and tried to get by on mumbles and smiles. He didn't want strangers to hear his mistakes, so he used me to make phone calls and to talk to the landlady and to buy things in the store where you had to use English. He got younger, I got older. He'd been a farmer, but here he couldn't work. He couldn't sit out in the plaza and talk. There aren't any plazas here, and if you sit out in public, some gang driving by might use you for target practice. He couldn't understand TV, so he wandered around the apartment all day, in and out of rooms, talking to himself, just like a kid in diapers. So this is your time to come up with those 3 questions, and you might know the answer to those questions. So you can be the teacher and ask the person who might be watching this video with you to see if they know the answer. Or you might be asking questions that you just genuinely want to know the answer to. So take a moment for that before we move on to the next slide. Okay, moving on. Characterization activity. Read the excerpt below and get out that highlighter. We're going to highlight passages that defend the following statement. Garcia feels responsible for his father and worries about his father's well-being. Garcia feels responsible for his father and worries about his father's well-being. So you're going to highlight places in the text we're going to read together now where you feel it is defending that statement of Garcia feeling responsible for his father and worrying about his father's well-being. One morning, his father, Garcia's father, one morning he wandered outside and down the street. My mother practically fainted. He doesn't speak Spanish, just an Indian language. I finally found him standing in front of the beauty parlor, staring through the glass at a woman with a dryer over her head. He must have wondered what weird planet he'd moved to. I led him home, holding his hand the way you would with a 3-year-old. Since then, I'm supposed to babysit him after school. One afternoon, I was watching TV, getting smart on the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch was a very popular show in the 70s, in the 1970s. One afternoon, I was watching TV, getting smart on the Brady Bunch. Suddenly, I looked up. He was gone. So this is his father. I checked. This is Garcia's father. Garcia, my father, was gone. I checked the halls on all 5 floors of the apartment house. I ran to the street. He wasn't in the bodega or the pawn shop. I called his name, imagining my mother's face when she found out he'd fallen through a manhole or been run over. I turned the corner looking for the white straw hat he always wore. 2 blocks down, I spotted it. I flew down the sidewalk and found him standing in front of a vacant lot, making gestures to a man with a shovel. I took his hand, but he pulled me through the trash and into the lot. I recognized the man with the shovel. He was the janitor at my old school. He had a little garden planted. Different shades of green leaves were coming up in rows. Tio Juan was smiling and trying to tell him something. The man couldn't understand him and finally went back to digging. I turned to Tio Juan around and led him home. So your job is to find examples where Garcia feels responsible for his dad and worries about his dad's well-being. And you'll notice, again, these vignettes are all connected because last week we read together the chapter Wendell. And you may recall Wendell was a janitor. So here we have in this last paragraph, Garcia, took his hand, his father's, but he pulled me through the trash and into the lot. I recognized the man with the shovel. He was the janitor, Wendell, at my old school. So we're getting to learn about the characters from other people's perspectives. Take a moment to highlight the passages that defend the statement that Garcia feels responsible for his dad and worries about his father's well-being. One easy one, and the rest you're going to do on your own. Since then, I'm supposed to babysit him after school. I would highlight that because that shows, that demonstrates that he feels responsible for his father's well-being. Okay, we're going to move on, and you can always go back to this. Inferencing practice, and I purposely chose this image of a detective because when we make inferences, we are drawing conclusions based on facts that we have. So you are playing the role of a detective when you're reading for context clues and for those inferences. So let's do some practice. I'm going to move my screen so you can see. Okay. Defend this statement by highlighting evidence from the text. So we're being that litigator again. We're being a lawyer. We're being a detective. So Garcia is embarrassed by what his father is doing. You're going to defend it, highlight, circle, underline, show in this paragraph proof that demonstrates Garcia is embarrassed by what his father is doing. That night, he told, so this is Garcia's father he's talking about. That night, he told my mother all about it. She was the only one who could understand him. When she got home from work the next day, she asked me to take him back there. I did. He studied the sun, then the soil. He felt it, then smelled it, then actually tasted it. He chose a spot not too far from the sidewalk. Where my mother changed buses, she'd gone into a store and bought him a trowel and 4 packets of seeds. I cleared the trash. He turned the soil. I wished we were farther from the street, and I was praying that none of my friends or girlfriends or enemies saw me. Tio Juan didn't even notice people. He was totally wrapped up. And my apologies here, the paragraph got cut off there. But his father was so wrapped up in the soil, in this process of planting, that he didn't even notice the other people. So your job is to find the sentence or words or phrases that defend the statement in red here. Garcia is embarrassed by what his father is doing. Show us where that is evident. So if you look here, I wish we were farther from the street and I was praying that none of my friends or girlfriends or enemies saw me. He's clearly embarrassed by what his father is doing. Otherwise, he wouldn't be praying that none of his friends saw what his father was doing. Good job if you got that. This is not easy, this inferencing. Okay, connecting through illustration. Here's another activity for us. Read the final paragraph of chapter 4 and then create an illustration based on the text. So we're going to finish today's lesson with a fun illustration or opportunity to illustrate. We're going to read the final paragraph and then create an illustration just based on this last paragraph, this text. He showed me exactly how far apart, he showed me exactly how far apart the rows should be and how deep. He couldn't read the words on the seed packets, but he knew from the pictures what seeds were inside. He poured them into his hand and smiled. He seemed to recognize them, like old friends. Watching him carefully sprinkling them into the troughs he'd made, I realized that I didn't know anything about growing food and that he knew everything. I stared at his busy fingers, then his eyes. They were focused, not far away or confused. He changed from a baby back into a man. So you can envision this man who is illiterate when it comes to the English language. Illiterate meaning he can't read or write, has found happiness again as a farmer in Ohio in this lot where he can start planting seeds. So think about that when you're making your illustration. Perhaps Tio, his father, Garcia's father, is showing how engaged he is in this act of going through the trough and planting the seeds, all the excitement on his face. And if illustrating is something that isn't for you, you don't have to illustrate. You can articulate with words what is going on, how Garcia's father feels, and how Garcia is watching his father, and how that makes him feel. And you can see how he feels because the last line he says, when my father changed from a baby back into a man. His father was a baby in Garcia's eyes when he couldn't communicate. His ability to communicate was stripped from him when he left his country. And what's interesting is they came from Guatemala, but for whatever reason, he didn't know Spanish, his father. He only knew an Indian language. So he was completely dependent on the mother to communicate with and his son to communicate with him, which would cause a lot of frustration and therefore a lot of excitement when he finally found a way to communicate through this gardening, through farming, even in an urban city of Ohio in the back of a parking lot that was converted to a place to plant, thanks to our first character in the vignette series, Kim. So I'm gonna go back to the beginning and know that while we today studied the objective of generating questions, you want to think about asking open-ended questions. Why and how are great open-ended initiating questions that drive us to go deeper. More fact-based questions would be things like what and who, because they have a concrete answer. But when you ask questions like how and why, please explain, that is going to cause you to go deeper into and understanding the text and helping your peers understand a text more. I want to thank you for today's time together. I'm going to show you all this quickly, but know that you can see this online, and I look forward to next week when we get to meet again on our next chapter of Seed Folks by Paul Fleischman. Thank you.